Hello and welcome. I'm Emma Wegner, Associate Educator in Public Programs and Creative Practice at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We're so glad you could join us today for the Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series, an annual lecture offered by the Departments of Egyptian Art, Ancient Near Eastern Art, and Islamic Art. The theme for this year's lecture is African Communities, Reflections of Coexistence and Cooperation. This program is made possible by the Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series Fund. Our program today features 3 speakers who will each begin their presentation at the beginning of the hour after an introduction from 3 of my Met colleagues. We will begin with Erin M. D'Souza, introduced by Diana Craig Patch, the Lila Atchison Wallace Curator in charge of the Department of Egyptian Art. Our second speaker is Michael J. Harrower, who will be introduced by Michael Seymour, Associate Curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. Our final speaker is Paulo Fernando de Moraes Farias, who will be introduced by Navina Haidar, Nasser Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Sabah Curator in charge of the Department of Islamic Art. After our final talk, there will be a half-hour Q&A session with the 3 speakers. Please use the Q&A Zoom function if you'd like to ask a question at that time. As a reminder, throughout our program, you can turn on live captions by clicking the More button in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen and selecting Show Subtitle. Now, to introduce our first speaker and to share some of the history of this lecture series, I would like to welcome Diana Craig Patch, the Lila Atchison Wallace Curator in charge of the Department of Egyptian Art. Diana?
I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the 2021 Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series entitled African Communities, Reflections of Coexistence and Cooperation. This year's presentations are by Paulo Fernando de Moraes Farias, FBA, Michael J. Harrower, and Erin M. D'Souza, and they will explore social, religious, and economic interconnections in Africa and with its neighbors. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to talk a bit about the man in whose honor this program was created. Charles K. Wilkinson was part of the Met staff for 66 years, until his death in 1987. His friends endowed a fund that yearly supports this wonderful event. The lecture series provides scholars who specialize in the topics covered by our 3 departments, that is, Egyptian art, ancient Near Eastern art, and Islamic art. It gives them a venue to share their expertise focused around a single topic. Charles K. Wilkinson joined the Met in 1920 and for 11 years worked as a graphic artist with Norman Daguerre's Davies, copying ancient Egyptian tomb paintings, many of which are exhibited in Gallery 135, the Facsimile Gallery. In 1956, he was appointed curator of the Department of Ancient Near East and continued in that position even after it merged with Islamic art in 1959. He chaired both of these departments until he retired in 1963. He was also a curator in Ancient Near East at the Brooklyn Museum and an adjunct professor of Islamic art at Columbia University. He was an active and respected scholar in all 3 fields, and in addition to the beautiful Egyptian tomb paintings, his publication on the wall, Decorations from Nishapur, remains an important study of the site. So honoring his memory, I'm pleased to begin today's program by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Erin D'Souza. Erin is an archaeologist who specializes in Nubian material culture of the 2nd millennium BCE. His research focuses on objects that allow him to consider the complex inter- and intra-cultural contexts that took place throughout the greater Nile Valley between 2000 and 1000 BCE. In 2017, Erin received his PhD in Egyptology from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and he is currently a Liza Meitner postdoctoral fellow at the Austrian Archaeological Institute in Vienna. His project there, entitled Living Nubia, and his research is supported by the Austrian Science Fund. Previously, he was a fellow at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Erin specializes in Nubian ceramics and has brought his expertise to many archaeological excavations in Egypt. Currently, he works with the Tel Edfu project. Erin is busy with other scholarly activities, including having recently founded a new online journal called Interdisciplinary Egyptology, hosted by the University of Vienna. He also serves as a member of the Publications and Communication Committee of the Egypt Exploration Society in London. Aaron will now share his insights on Nubian material in the Greater Nile Valley in a presentation entitled Outsiders on the Inside, the Enigmatic Pangrave Culture in the Ancient Nile Valley. Aaron, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Great. Thank you, Diana, for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak at this year's event. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here, even if it is unfortunately only virtually. And I still find it quite hard to believe that I've been invited to present a lecture for the Met, and it's even more strange to me that I'm doing this from a hotel room in Sweden at the moment. And I also want to thank Niv Alon for making the initial introduction to the department and to all of the team at the Met who have helped out today, but a special thank you to the department administrator, Elizabeth Miller, who has been extremely helpful and patient with all of my annoying questions leading up to today. And thank you also to all of you for attending tonight, wherever you are in the world. And a good morning to any of my friends and family from Sydney in Australia who might happen to be watching at 3 a.m. So I know today I'm supposed to be here as an Egyptology speaker, but as you'll have seen from the program, I'm actually going to be talking to you about ancient Nubia, or rather, some ancient people that we associate with ancient Nubia or with being Nubian. Ancient Nubia has been getting a lot more attention recently than it has in the past, especially as countries around the world are grappling with colonial histories that have been and continue to be the dominant historical narratives around the world. But what do we mean when we actually talk about ancient Nubia? In most cases, when people think of Nubia, they think of something separate to ancient Egypt, something that's located in the lands to the south of the First Cataract, which is near modern Aswan, something that was not part of Pharaonic Egypt, but that was conquered and dominated and exploited by the pharaohs, and in short, something that is seen as an other in relation to ancient Egypt, and within the context of Egyptology as an academic discipline. But what I want to try and do today is to demonstrate that actually this hard division between Egyptian and Nubian is not always so clear. Of course, Nubia has its own distinct and rich history, independent of ancient Egypt, but during the Pharaonic period, the histories of ancient Egypt and Nubia were so deeply intertwined that sometimes it's nearly impossible to distinguish where one ends and the other begins. So today I want to talk about this issue of division between Egypt and Nubia and between Egyptian and Nubian, and to raise the idea that this quite modern division is holding the discipline back in some ways. And I want to explore this issue by using as a case study an ancient culture that is described as Nubian, but that often goes overlooked in Egyptology. Today we know that culture by the somewhat strange name of Pangrave. But this enigmatic and often disregarded archaeological phenomenon has the capacity to push Egyptology as an academic discipline to fundamentally question what it meant to be Egyptian in the ancient world. And it can also force us to reassess these assumed divisions that have been imposed upon the region of Northeast Africa. But what is this so-called Pangrave culture all about? So let's now go back about 3,800 years to 1850 to 1550 BCE, to the Nile Valley, specifically the area between Middle Egypt and the Second Nile Cataract, which is marked by the red line that you can see on the map. This period corresponds roughly to the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate periods in Egypt, during which time centralized Pharaonic rule had collapsed, the rulers known as the Hyksos had taken control of the north, and the Kerma Kingdom was gaining power in the south, and the remnants of Pharaonic rule was sandwiched in between. So we're dealing with a politically volatile period, but one that's also very multicultural. Political boundaries were constantly in flux, and communities from the Levant, Nubia, and Egypt were coming into contact with one another in all sorts of complex ways. So what we now call the Pangrave was just one of those cultures, and it was first described in 1901 by Flinders Petrie at the site of Diospolis Parva in Egypt. The graves and the objects in them were entirely unfamiliar to Petrie, and so he defined it as a new cultural entity, based on its distinctive assemblages that, to Petrie at least, seemed entirely non-Egyptian. In the case of the Pangrave culture, the evidence is almost exclusively from funerary contexts, from cemeteries. And we don't know of any habitation sites that we can definitively associate with the culture. And it's possible that Pangrave communities might have lived in or around existing urban centers, which is a theme that I'll come back to later on. But ultimately, the evidence is almost entirely funerary. And so we have to keep that in mind, that we are only seeing one aspect of the story. We also don't know where Pangrave culture came from. assuming that it came from anywhere in the first place, or how it becomes recognizable in the archaeology of the region. What seems to be the case, though, is that these communities that we see emerging in the Nile Valley around 1850 BCE are likely related to nomadic pastoral cultures that roamed the desert regions to the east of the Nile, and that some of those communities chose to settle in or near the Nile Valley for an as yet unknown reason. Sometimes it's suggested that it had something to do with environmental changes in the desert that drove people towards the Nile, but there's no hard evidence for this. It's also been suggested that political change and the decline of Egyptian control in the region made it easier for outsiders to move into the Nile Valley. It could also be a combination of both of these things, and probably also other factors. And it's even been suggested by my colleague and friend, Kate Lisker, that Pangrave communities may have always been in the Nile Valley and that social or political changes led to their material culture somehow becoming more visible in the archaeology. We really just don't know. So what makes them so distinctive? Well, given that the data is almost entirely from cemeteries, let's start with their graves. Mostly the graves are circular and shallow, sometimes less than a meter deep, and Petrie described them as being pan-shaped, which is where the name Pangrave comes from. The grave pits could be lined with reed matting or with animal hides, and the deceased was placed in the grave in a tightly contracted position lying on their sides. Sometimes the graves had an above-ground superstructure, which could vary from a ring of stones to a pile of loose debris, but more often than not, there was no superstructure at all. They produced distinctive types of pottery, mostly open bowl forms, which were made by hand without the use of a potter's wheel. And generally speaking, Pangrave pottery was quite fine and well made, with thin walls, burnished and red on the outside, black on the inside, and they often have black tops, and sometimes they have incised decoration in simple linear geometric patterns. And the repertoire is almost entirely bowl-shaped vessels, including these so-called horned bowls, which are unique to the Pangrave ceramic tradition and easily recognizable by their distinctive horns. There are also distinctive types of jewelry and clothing, especially these so-called spacer beads or plaque beads made from mother of pearl, like the ones you can see at the top of the screen in the blue box. And these were worn as bands, usually around the forearms. This type of bead doesn't seem to occur in relation to any other Nubian culture, and so it's been suggested that it is a marker for Pangrave. There are also necklaces and bracelets made of a particular type of shell called nerita, for which the closest known source is the Red Sea. There are also beads in semi-precious stones like amethyst, garnet, and carnelian, and remains of leather garments with tassels and beaded fringing. All in all, these items give us a sense of how these people might have dressed and appeared in life, and it seems that they were elaborately adorned. But perhaps the most distinctive and striking of all of the material culture associated with the Pangrave tradition are these skulls and horns of livestock animals, cattle, sheep or goat, and sometimes even gazelles, that were frequently painted with striking red and black designs and placed in rings around some of the larger burials. And I was lucky enough to be present when one of these was being excavated at Hierakonpolis back in 2017, which is a site that we'll return to. And it was a rather haunting experience to see that these painted eyes emerging from the sand for the first time in almost 4,000 years. But as with most things Pangrave, we really don't know the significance of these objects, but they do give us some insights into their relationship with their animals. In some cases, there could be dozens of such objects arranged in arc-shaped troughs that surrounded some of the larger burials. And a colleague, Pernille Bangsiad, has found that the skulls were often arranged in such a way that they reflect a herd structure, with the large male bull at the front, followed by female cows, and then smaller animals like sheep and goat following behind. And you can see that quite clearly in this example from a Pangrave cemetery located in the Second Nile Cataract. These burial features also offer some clues about internal social structures. For example, at the cemetery SJE Site 47, which is the largest known Pangrave cemetery in Nubia, the graves surrounded by animal skulls are all in one part of the site, which suggests that these could be burials representing a particular social group, possibly senior community members or the people who are in charge of the herds. And there are also some interesting parallels with more recent African pastoral cultures. For example, the Mbandaru communities in Namibia include a person called the man of the herd, who is responsible for caring for the animals, and upon his death, the part of the herd that he personally owned is slaughtered and consumed over the course of about a year. Then at the end of this period, the skulls of those animals are placed above his grave. And of course, we have to be careful in drawing connections between recent cultures and those from the long distant past. But in this case, the similarity seems quite compelling. But for me personally, the thing that I find most captivating about the Pangrave culture is its humanness, which I know sounds a little bit flippant, but let me elaborate. Of course, the ancient Egyptians were human too, And of course, they weren't all pharaohs and royalty or elite people with pyramids and painted tombs, because they were obviously normal folks just like you and me going about their daily business. But generally speaking, the image of ancient Egypt that we see in books and on TV and in museums is almost always from a top-down perspective. It's all about the monumental temples, pyramids, rock-cut tombs with elaborate decoration, stone statues of royalty and gods, golden jewels, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these things are amazing. And let's be honest, these are the things that get most of us interested in ancient Egypt, myself included. But in some way, these things are also monumental that they become a little bit distant and sometimes feel like you can't relate to them on a personal level. But with the Pangrave culture, everything is on a very human scale. The pottery can fit comfortably in one hand. The jewelry is small and simple and would fit neatly around your wrist. The reed and leather matting, which is in the graves, can be rolled up and carried under your arm. And the animal skulls appear to have been painted with fingers. But to really illustrate this deeply human aspect of Pangrave culture, I'd like to show you a remarkable and unique feature from one Pangrave cemetery that I was lucky enough to see with my own eyes and to touch with my own hands. So let's now go back to that site called Hierakonpolis, which is in southern Egypt, about halfway between Luxor and Aswan. Specifically, I'd like to look at a locality known as HK 47, which is one of two Pangrave cemeteries at the site, which are in turn two of only a handful of Pangrave sites that are still surviving and accessible. I was lucky enough to be there when the site was excavated in 2017 as a part of the Hierakonpolis expedition directed by Dr. Renee Friedman, and I thank Renee for her permission to use these images today. The site may not look like much from the surface, but there are some very special things under only a few inches of sand. We've already seen a few of those special things from Hierakonpolis in the pictures, so the painted cow skull, some garnet beads, and some leather tassels. But what I want to focus on right now is this triangular grayish-brown surface that you can see covering a part of the excavated area. It's actually a natural layer of mud, and the people that use this place as their cemetery modified that mud in some unusual ways. Some of the graves were cut through the mud, like the circular grave that you can see marked with the arrow, and other graves were placed immediately adjacent to it, and some graves were even placed on the surface of the mud. But it's that surface in particular that I'm interested in right now. So let's zoom in a little bit. So while the mud itself is a natural feature, the dimples that you can see on the surface of the mud are not natural features. In fact, the surface of the mud has been deliberately manipulated and, believe it or not, those dimples are impressions left by hands and fingers. And if you don't believe me, we'll zoom in a little bit further again. So right now, this probably looks like a mess of dimples and depressions on some mud, but if I do this, you can see that actually it is a handprint that's about the same size as my own. And there were handprints and fingerprints all over the surface of this mud. And it was quite a moving experience to be able to put my hands and fingers into these impressions and to know that someone almost 4,000 years ago was at this very same place and making the very same gestures. And for me, it's this completely unique feature and this completely unique experience that really exemplifies the humanness of what we today call the Pangrave culture. And it's that same humanness that can open up a window into aspects of the past that can't be gained from the most monumental of temples or the most glittering golden jewelry. So let's now look into that window and to clear up some misconceptions about the Pangrave culture, to talk about the enigmatic culture that can make us rethink these boundaries and divisions that have been imposed upon the archaeology and history of Northeast Africa. So let's start first with one of the more complicated issues. And frankly, I admit it pains me to bring this up a bit because it is such a convoluted problem that it deserves a lecture all on its own. So what I'm going to say in the next minute or so is heavily summarized, but it can't be ignored in the context of this conversation. What I'm referring to is the long-standing traditional assumption that the Pangrave culture is the same as the so-called Medjay, which is known from Egyptian texts. For a long time, these two cultural constructs were equated with one another, and it was assumed that the Pangrave culture was the archaeological manifestation of the historical Medjay, which is known only from texts and art. During the period in question, that is the Second Intermediate period in Egypt, the ancient Egyptians tell us that these Medjay worked primarily as mercenary soldiers fighting on the side of the Egyptian rulers against the Hyksos invaders, and so it was assumed that the Pangrave communities represent those mercenary communities. But how correct is this assumption? This equation between Pangrave and Medjay was based on some archaeological coincidences, mainly that Pangrave sites were only identified in territory controlled by Egyptian rulers, and also that some Pangrave burials included archery equipment, like these remarkably preserved arrow butts from Hierakonpolis with the feather fletching still attached, as well as Egyptian-made weapons like daggers and axes in bronze. These assumptions went largely unchallenged for about a century, but it now seems that it's not so clear-cut. While it is possible that some Pangrave individuals or communities might be linked with mercenary service, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were Medjay, and it certainly doesn't apply to all Pangrave communities or individuals. Only a handful of sites include these Egyptian-made weapons, and very often these weapons are found in the graves of women, children, and even sometimes infants. So we shouldn't automatically assume that the weapons represent soldiers, and therefore we shouldn't assume that Pangrave equals Medjay. We also have to recognize that the word Medjay is only known from Egyptian sources, and it may not actually have been used by or even understood by the people that it's supposed to describe. Not only that, the term Medjay is attested in Egyptian texts for a lot longer than the Pangrave culture exists in the archaeology, and we don't fully understand what the term Medjay even means. Does it denote an ethnicity? Does it denote a geographic origin in the same way that an Australian comes from Australia? It might refer to an occupation because Medjay at different times could be soldiers or mercenaries or temple attendants or police officers or other things. So as it stands, there's no clarity about how these two cultural constructs, Pangrave and Medjay, should be related, or even if they should be related at all. And it's unlikely that these questions will ever be answered, but it's just one example where something that we thought we knew about the Pangrave culture turns out to be not so clear. You might have also noticed that I keep using phrases like the so-called Pangrave culture or what we now call Pangrave culture. And that's because the Pangrave culture, as we currently understand it, is essentially made up. It's what we call an archaeological culture, which is an entirely modern construct where a culture is externally defined based solely on archaeological remains and specifically using a predetermined set of particular object types. So in this case, if a grave contained all of the objects that I've just shown you, it's deemed to be part of the Pangrave culture. So you can think of it like a cultural box into which all of the defining characteristics are packed. And as researchers, we need parameters like these boxes to help us organize these masses of data. But the problem with boxes is that they make everything neat and tidy, and they homogenize something that is actually very heterogeneous, complex, diverse, and highly variable. In fact, in my own research, I found that every Pangrave site is entirely unique, and I no longer believe that it is a single cultural entity that fits into such a neat box. So in a way, as archaeologists and researchers, we've created a rod for our own backs because we need boxes to help us organize the information, but the boxes give us headaches. But anyway, this Pangrave box and all other similar cultural boxes have been imposed by archaeologists onto the archaeological record based on our own external perspectives and shaped by our own social conditioning. And in the end, our perception and definition of those boxes very likely has no bearing on what the actual people may or may not have thought about themselves. We already know that the term Pangrave is made up, and it's derived from the pan-shaped graves at a handful of sites. But the people that we now call Pangrave didn't leave behind any writing of their own to tell us who they were, what they called themselves, or even if they called themselves anything at all. So as archaeologists, we're always on the outside looking in. And from that perspective, and in the context of Egyptology as a discipline, the Pangrave culture has long been viewed as an other. They left no texts behind, no statues, no coffins, no painted tombs, no golden jewelry, no temples, no stelae. Their pottery is different, their jewelry is different, their graves are different. So therefore, they get packed away into a box that is labeled not Egyptian. But this idea that Pangrave culture was something other has shaped all of the scholarship about them since the very beginning. In the very first description of the Pangrave culture by Petrie, he described them as, quote, a barbaric people. And others after him, such as George Reisner and Cecil Firth, proposed that the Pangrave's seemingly sudden appearance was a result of their having been driven northward by poverty, which was seen as, or towards Egypt, which was seen as the more civilized and more prosperous land of opportunity. And then once in Egypt, the old idea was that Pangrave communities worked as servants or slaves or sold themselves as mercenaries fighting for Egyptian kings. Over time, and as a result of intensive interactions with Egyptian communities, the Pangrave culture was thought to have Egyptianized, meaning that Egyptian customs and objects were adopted so extensively that Pangrave communities assimilated and were subsumed into the Egyptian cultural sphere. All of these things might at least be partially true, but they're all very Egypt-centric perspectives. Ancient Egypt was for a long time assumed to be the richer, more powerful, more culturally coercive, whereas Nubian cultures were seen to be weaker, poorer, less developed, and more easily dominated. But we know now that this is not true. And if we dig a little deeper, we can start to see that actually these divisions between Egyptian and Nubian start to break down quite easily. And this is no more clearly expressed than by looking at where sites and objects attributed to the Pangrave culture have been found. So here is a map showing all of the known cemeteries that have been attributed either fully or partially to the Pangrave culture. But now let's add what are traditionally thought to be, or thought to have been, the ancient boundaries between ancient Egypt and Nubia. The ideological and symbolic boundaries between Egypt and Nubia for the ancient Egyptians were situated at the First Nile Cataract near modern Aswan, which is marked by the pink line on the map. This is a natural stopping point where the Nile is crowded with granite boulders and islands and rapids, making it difficult to pass by boat. And it's also what the ancient Egyptians considered their southern frontier with Nubia. But if we look at where Pangrave sites are located in relation to that boundary, we can see that actually about half of the sites are located north of that border, in territory that was under pharaonic Egyptian control. And so this density of supposedly Nubian activity in Egyptian-controlled territory seems incongruous with the official ancient Egyptian ideologies that described ancient Nubians as wretched and vile and as something that needed to be kept out. So there's a disconnect between what ancient Egyptian texts tell us and what is actually happening on the ground. While the ancient Egyptian texts tell us that anyone that they perceived as foreign was bad and had to be kept out, there were communities of those very same foreigners living and working in Egyptian-controlled territory. We also need to remember, though, that these official texts would only have been accessible to a tiny portion of the population, maybe less than 1% of people who could read and write. So who were these texts for then? Presumably they were for people and the institutions in charge who had the stake in keeping Egypt Egyptian and who had assumed that the responsibility of maintaining certain ideologies and attitudes that had been handed down to them by history. But as we can see, the archaeology suggests that actually visible foreignness was probably not that unusual in everyday ancient Egypt. We can see the Pangrave communities seem to have been all over the place in southern Egypt. Their cemeteries are very often close to or integrated with Egyptian-style burials and cemeteries. And most Pangrave burials include Egyptian-style objects, so clearly they could acquire these objects and they saw it fit to put them in their own graves. But the continued presence of distinctively non-Egyptian types of jewelry, clothing, and pottery suggests that their otherness could be displayed through the things that they used and wore in life. And equally, the distinctly non-Egyptian graves and cemeteries suggest that they could continue that display even in death. So considering how visibly different and widespread Pangrave communities were in ancient Egypt, how foreign were they really? And how can this challenge us to redefine what we mean by Egyptian and Nubian in the context of Northeast Africa? And this brings us back to that idea of Egyptianization, which I've already briefly mentioned, but that deserves a little bit more attention. Egyptianization is an old colonial approach that assumes that everything that comes into contact with ancient Egyptian culture was so overwhelmed that its own original culture dissolves and succumbs to the power of pharaonic Egypt. And for a long time, Egyptianization was given as the reason for the supposed disappearance of the Pangrave culture at the beginning of the 18th dynasty and the reunification of Egypt. The idea was that Pangrave communities assumed Egyptian objects and practices to such an extent that they became indistinguishable from contemporary Egyptian burials and hence disappeared. In relation to the Pangrave culture, Egyptianization was supposedly visible in the change from very non-Egyptian circular graves with bodies in a contracted position to the more typically Egyptian-style rectangular graves with extended burials, and by increasing numbers of Egyptian material culture objects in those graves. Some of my earlier research had a look at this question and found that actually it's not really the case, and even the latest and most Egyptianized Pangrave burials are still recognizably non-Egyptian. And the fact that we can even identify them as Egyptianized Pangrave in the first place shows that they are still distinct in terms of material culture and associated practices. So rather than just following the old line of reasoning that Nubian cultures succumbed to Egyptian influence, we can instead see that contact and exchange was taking place in more complex and interesting ways. And it's not just graves and burials that show these complex exchanges, but it's also manifest in the objects themselves. And some of the best examples of these are these evocative and enigmatic painted animal skulls that we saw earlier. But before we go on, just a quick reminder what these objects are. So they are skulls and frontal bones of livestock animals with painted decoration. They're apparently unique to the Pangrave culture. And normally the painted decoration is simple and non-figurative, consisting simply of lines and dots in red and black pigment. But I want to show you now two examples that do not fit this mold. And unfortunately, though, I have to show you line drawings because both of these objects are showing their age. They are nearly 4,000 years old. And today the decoration is very faded and difficult to see in photographs. So the drawings will have to suffice because I show things more clearly. Both of these objects were found at Mostagaida, which is a cemetery in Middle Egypt, about halfway between Aswan and Cairo. And based on the data that we have, the Pangrave burials here are some of the latest in the Nile Valley. And as such, A lot of them are some of the most Egyptianized. These painted skulls were not associated directly with the burial, but they come from what was likely to have been an offering deposit containing about 40 skulls of livestock animals. The first is at the top center of the screen. It's a frontal bone from a goat. That is the top part of the skull where the horns are attached. But unlike the other examples I've shown you, the decoration on the skull is more than just dots and lines. It's decorated with a pair of eyes, but even more strikingly with a lotus blossom, which is something that we would normally associate with Egyptian iconography, the lotus being a symbol for rebirth and regeneration. But the second example is even more interesting because it goes beyond just figurative decoration. This ox skull is decorated with the depiction of a human figure and with a text written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, which you can see in the square on the screen. So let's start with the human figure. Firstly, it's so far the only known depiction of a human of a human from a Pangrave archaeological context. And secondly, that human figure is depicted following ancient Egyptian artistic canons. Just like a painting from a wall scene in an Egyptian tomb, the face is in profile, the eye is drawn face on, the shoulders are frontal, the hips, legs, and feet are in profile. But the person on the skull is also carrying an axe, which you can see peeking out just above the shoulder, which is shaped like a duckbill. So it's often assumed that the person was a soldier of some kind, usually assumed to be a Medjay. But now let's have a look at the text, which appears to be some kind of label. As it stands, the text hasn't been translated. It says something like keskanet or kesdanet, but this isn't a word that we know from the ancient Egyptian vocabulary. Julian Cooper and Hans Barnard have recently wrote an in-depth article about this little text and suggest that it could mean something like the bone of something or someone. So it could be a label identifying ownership of this particular object, or perhaps it's the name of the person depicted. For now, it remains a mystery. But what are we seeing here? So we have objects that are fundamentally Pangrave in character, animal skulls with painted decoration, but they are decorated in a manner that one would normally associate with pharaonic Egyptian culture. They are what I would call assertive objects, something that doesn't fit easily into one tradition or another, but that exists somewhere in between. They are neither Pangrave nor Egyptian, but they're equally both at the same time. They assert something about this particular experience of existing between two or more traditions. Or it might also be called an example of material entanglement, where two or more cultural spheres become so deeply entangled that new forms of material culture emerge. But what I think is most significant here is that it gives us a clue about how these so-called Pangrave communities, these supposed outsiders, fit into the socio-cultural landscape of ancient pharaonic Egypt. The larger skull with the text in particular suggests that at least some individuals in the Pangrave communities might have acquired the ability to read and write Egyptian hieroglyphs, or that they were able to commission someone to write them for them. And that they could use those Egyptian hieroglyphs to write something in what was presumably their own language. So rather than interpreting this as Egyptianization or the replacement of Pangrave culture with Egyptian, we should perhaps take a different perspective. What it could tell us is that Pangrave communities, or at least some of them, were able to acquire knowledge of hieroglyphs and Egyptian language, and that they were able to adopt and apply that knowledge to material culture that was distinctly their own. And that even with all of this entanglement and exchange and mixing of Pangrave and Egyptian cultural elements, the Pangraveness of the objects remains distinct. So given how distinctly non-Egyptian these objects are, can we really think about them as being Egyptianized? Another important thing to recognize is in relation to Egyptianization is that it wasn't a one-way street. And there are a number of instances in which Nubian material culture finds its way into Egyptian cultural contexts. For example, Pangrave-style pottery has been found in Egyptian shaft and chamber tombs at Abydos, and some of those painted skulls have even been found in large tombs at Deir el-Bersha in Middle Egypt. But one rich source of data, and one that I've had the most experience with, is ceramics. And we've already heard that Egyptian-style pottery is common in Pangrave burials, but there is also a substantial amount of Nubian-style pottery, including Pangrave pottery, in Egyptian settlements. So let's now go to Tel Edfu, which is located in the south of Egypt, about halfway between Luxor and Aswan. And if you visited Egypt, you probably have stopped at this site to visit the famous Temple of Horus. I've been working at this site since 2015 with a team directed by Professor Nadine Mola and Dr. Gregory Marawad from Yale University. And I can tell you that there is a substantial amount of Nubian-style pottery, which looks like this. It's present in varying proportions in just about every context dating to the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, which corresponds to the time that the Pangrave culture was visible in the archaeological record. And it's not just at Edfu. because there is Nubian-style pottery at Egyptian habitation sites of the same period all along the Nile. For example, at Elefantina near Aswan, at Wasut near Abydos, at El Kab near Edfu, and at ancient Memphis near Cairo, at the Egyptian fortresses, the so-called temple towns in Nubia. There are even small amounts at sites in Western Desert oases and in the Nile Delta and on the Red Sea coast. So again, like the cemeteries, we can get a sense of just how widespread Nubian material culture and objects are, or were. But the question is, why do we think that this pottery is Nubian, even if it's found, or especially if it's found en masse in Egyptian settlements in Egypt? The first thing is that we find the same types of pottery in very frequently in Nubian settlement sites in Nubia. So that's an indication. But also this Nubian-style pottery is stylistically, materially, and technologically very distinct from Egyptian pottery. The vessels are all open bowl-shaped forms, often with some kind of incised decoration on the exterior, whereas Egyptian pottery occurs in all kinds of shapes, including plates, bowls, jars, and large storage vessels, and the vessels are rarely decorated. There are also technological differences. Nubian pottery was made by hand, which is not on a wheel, and the vessel fabric, that is the material used to make the pots, is soft and black and crumbly, which suggests that it was fired at a low temperature. By contrast, Egyptian pottery is almost always made on a turning wheel, but not always, and the vessel fabric is usually much lighter in color, more dense and harder, indicating that it was fired at a higher temperature for a longer period. The Nubian pottery in settlements is also quite different to the stuff that we've seen in cemeteries, because it's usually much coarser and rougher with thicker walls, and as such, it's likely to have been utilitarian in function. And a lot of the pots, in fact, have soot on their exterior, which suggested they were used over a fire, most probably for cooking. So there are two distinct material traditions existing alongside one another at settlement contexts like or settlement sites like Edfu, all through the Nile Valley. But what does this mean, or what might this mean? In the early days of Egyptology, we might have interpreted this as indeed it was interpreted as evidence of Nubians working as cooks or servants for Egyptians, which is a super colonial perspective and one that was clearly born out of a world where this was the natural conclusion, that Nubians would have been subservient to Egyptians. But it's also just an overly simplistic conclusion. I sort of like to use the analogy of finding a wok in someone's kitchen in Vienna and assuming that that person had a live-in Chinese cook, which is completely absurd. So how else might we think of this stuff? The first thing to note is that this pottery should not automatically be assumed to indicate the presence of actual Nubian people. At most of these settlement sites, Edfu included, this Nubian pottery, or the Nubian-style pottery, is the only Nubian material culture that is present at the site. There might be Nubian cemeteries nearby, but there is nothing in the settlement itself other than this pottery to suggest a possible Nubian presence at the settlement. So how else might this pottery have ended up in Egyptian towns? One possibility is trade, but in a way this still assumes that the pottery was transported from Nubia, which seems like a lot of effort, and that it was traded from a Nubian cultural sphere into an Egyptian one, and that there were somehow Nubians involved in the process. But what if all this Nubian-style pottery that has been found in Egypt was actually made in Egypt? And what if it was used by the people that would otherwise be identified as Egyptian? And what if it's just a standard, albeit a small component, of the ceramic repertoire of these towns in the Nile Valley during this period? And ultimately, if it does turn out that this pottery was made in Egypt, why are we separating it from Egyptian-style pottery and treating it as something other? And this brings me to some other particular pottery from Edfu, which looks Nubian in style, but also it's not. And there are a couple of examples on the screen, which I admit don't look that interesting, but let's dissect them a little bit, and hopefully the interesting aspects will reveal themselves. So the first thing to note is that they have Nubian-style decoration, and they are the ones here on the bottom of the screen, which you can see in the left-hand column. And specifically, the decoration is incised cross-hatching, which looks very much like pangrave pottery that we saw in cemeteries. But you'll remember that I just talked about Nubian-style pottery being handmade and the fabric being black and crumbly. Well, this is neither of those things. First of all, the color is quite different. You can see the exterior looks black, but that's a layer of soot that adhered to the pot as a result of being used over a fire. But you can see that on the interior surface, the clay surface is much lighter, slightly orange-brown in color, which is more common for Egyptian-style pottery, whereas Nubian pottery is always black on the inside. So even though they are decorated like Nubian pots, they seem to have been fired in a way that is more common for Egyptian pottery. And you can see this even more clearly by looking at the cross-section of the pottery fabric. The Nubian pottery is on the left-hand side, and you can see it's almost entirely black with just a narrow band of brown near the exterior. But the showed from the mixed vessel is light brown and even pink in cross-section. which would indicate that it was fired at a higher temperature for a longer time, which is not the case for typical Nubian-style pottery. But also, unlike normal Nubian pottery, these examples are not handmade, but they were made on a turning wheel, and you can see that the traces of this in these black and white images that were taken using a method called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, which is used to highlight surface features that are difficult or impossible to see with the unaided eye. The horizontal ridges that you can see on the sherds were made by the potter's fingers as they pulled the clay up while the vessel was turning on a wheel. So here we have pottery from an Egyptian settlement in Egypt that combines Nubian style with Egyptian technology. And it's not unique to Edfu because this same kind of pottery has been documented at Elefantina near Aswan, at sites in the Western Desert Oases, and other examples from earlier periods are also known to exist. So what should we make of this? Are they still Nubian pots, or are they Egyptian now, or are they both? Or are they something new? Were they made by Nubian potters adopting Egyptian technology, or by Egyptian potters incorporating Nubian decoration and style? Was it someone taking advantage of taste for Nubian-style pottery in the markets? And why does any of this matter, really? So as you can see, these unassuming bits of broken pottery can raise a lot of questions, and they're the questions that we can probably never answer with any certainty. But what we can say for sure is that objects like these are just another instance in which these hard boundaries between Egyptian and Nubian become more and more indistinct. So even though there are so many unanswered questions, it's this complexity that, at least for me, makes the study of Nubian-Egyptian interactions so fascinating and dynamic. But in exploring these complex issues, there is one point that we should always keep in mind, and it's something that I want to make expressly clear. And that is that we should not try to say that Pangrave or Nubian communities were Egyptian, because that would completely contradict the push against colonial perspectives of the past. But at the same time, we also can't pretend that the relationship between Egypt and Nubia was all puppies and rainbows, because ancient Pharaonic Egypt as an institution was frequently extremely violent, exploitative, and antagonistic towards ancient Nubia. And at times, Nubians also exerted force against Egypt, even if it was on a much smaller scale. So instead, what I think we need is more in-depth, more balanced revisions of Nubian-Egyptian relations that ask different questions, that take different perspectives, and that do not automatically put ancient Egypt, ancient Pharaonic Egypt, at the center of the historical narrative. The dialogue needs to be balanced, and only by putting all of these various cultures and communities on an even level can we begin to rethink what we thought we knew about the intercultural relationships between cultures in ancient Northeast Africa. And ultimately, these new perspectives can challenge us to really think about what we mean when we use terms like Egyptian and Nubian in the context of the ancient world, and about the implications of applying such clear-cut labels. So perhaps what we need is a wider perspective that views Northeast Africa as a wide, interconnected region that itself shared links with its neighbors in the Levant, the Mediterranean, West Asia, and of course with other regions on the African continent. None of these regions ever existed in isolation. People, things, and ideas were in constant motion. Boundaries were negotiated and renegotiated over time as cultures and political fortunes ebbed and flowed, and much like our modern world, the ancient world was an interconnected one. For a long time, Egyptology as an academic discipline, and I stress as an academic discipline, has perpetuated this idea that ancient Egypt was a bubble and that it was somehow different or set apart from others, which continued the ideologies of the ancient Egyptian elite. There was Egypt, and then there is everything else. These old and outdated attitudes are slowly fading away, but they still persist in certain corners of the discipline. And sometimes people like me who specialize in the study of ancient Nubian cultures are still perceived as, at best, as working on the fringes of Egyptology. And at worst, we're sometimes not even considered part of Egyptology at all, which is why I'm extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to speak here today. But for me personally, I don't know what I am. I don't know whether I'm an Egyptologist or a Nubiologist, or if I'm somewhere in the middle, a bit like that weird painted pottery, or the weird painted skulls and pottery from Edfu. And like the Pangrave communities that I've talked about today, it's a bit like being an outsider and an insider at the same time. So if nothing else, I hope that I've demonstrated today that there were always outsiders on the inside in ancient Egypt, and that no matter how much the pharaohs tried to tell us that Nubians were wretched or vile, Nubian culture was for a long time part of the socio-cultural landscape of ancient Pharaonic Egypt. And in fact, Nubians were probably always there. I also hope to have demonstrated that an intensive look at a supposedly marginal aspect of the ancient Egyptian world, in this case, the Pangrave culture, can encourage Egyptology as a discipline to rethink where its own boundaries lie and to consider what Egyptology should be in the 21st century. Because the world of ancient Northeast Africa was more diverse and more interconnected than the pharaohs would like us to think. And so, in my opinion, if we want to properly understand and reflect that diversity, complexity, and interconnectedness, the discipline of Egyptology itself needs to be more diverse, complex, and interconnected. Thank you.